My name is Chris Morris. I'm an archivist at the Computer History Museum. I am here with Eddie Dinel. Today is October 18th, 2023, and we are conducting an interview for the VMware Founders Collection. This interview will become part of the collection at the Computer History Museum. Eddie, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Just for the record, can you say your current title and your location or home base?
Sure. I live in San Francisco and I am a director of product management here.
So tell us a little bit about your career and education path leading up to VMware.
Well, so I've been at VMware for what feels like an absurdly long time. It's been 21 years. Before VMware, I worked in a job that literally no longer exists because cloud computing took it away. I was the IT person for a small startup managing things like email and file service and so forth. And these are all now cloud services that are just done for you. And before that, I worked in IT at Stanford, and that's where I got my undergraduate degree in history. And then came over to VMware in our IT department 21 years ago.
So yes, I think you are the first person we've interviewed who has a history degree.
It's a little unusual. I do like to say that, the history and product management are very well aligned. One of them is you take a bunch of different data points and you assemble a narrative, and the other is take a bunch of different data points and assemble a good, problem statement.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So I have a future in product management.
There you go. Yes, absolutely. If that is something you choose to do, yes, I'm sure you would be very good at it.
So how did you, I know you also had some science and computer interest.
Yeah.
So where did that come from?
Minored in physics and computer science in school. And then as it turns out, I actually worked with one of the very early employee number one from VMware, Jeremy Sugarman. He and I worked together at the computer lab at Stanford when I was there. I learned a lot of the Linux administration and so forth from him. So that was part of how I got connected into VMware when we were a small place, smallish place then.
So what is it about computers and computing technology that got you excited in the beginning?
Well, so the first things that I really like, that's a hard question to answer. So are you curious about from a VMware perspective or a general perspective?
General perspective.
Oh, I went to Stanford in the 90s. It was hard not to be interested in computer science during that era. Like it was sort of generative. Everything was happening in and around here then. You couldn't do anything without interacting with people who were learning more about computers. And I liked playing with the tools and the technology and learning a bunch of stuff. And, like anything else, some of my best friends turned out to be computer science folks, and they went on to be very, very successful. And, so like I kind of hitched onto that and learned about it in the process.
Mm-hmm. So how did you land the job at VMware?
So I'm trying to decide if I should tell the politics story or the impolitics story. The short version is, as I said, I knew the employee number one, and he referred me in. And what was previously a 3-person IT team had just let one of their participants go, and they were looking for somebody who liked the portion of IT that is the human to IT system interaction. And my big skill when I was in IT was not, I was a fine system administrator. I could make systems that ran and so forth. But where I was really good was, what my boss sometimes called customer relationship management, where I would go talk to people about what the problems they were having with our internal IT systems were and help them understand better. And so forth. And that was not a skill that the other 2 participants in the IT team wanted to exercise. They had it if they needed it, but they didn't want to exercise that. They wanted to be a little bit more, locked in a room, get stuff done at the time.
What was the What was the culture of VMware like when you started?
It was a little jarring for me because I came from very California-y companies where it was like, oh, we have a wellness budget and we all go surfing at 4:30 in the afternoon, and then we come back and work till midnight, and around 11 o'clock we start playing computer games together. When I joined, it was the jarring part was that a lot of the IT folks had come from the NASD, from NASDAQ, and they were very serious about building seriously quality systems, and they were no BS. And it was like, no, like if the systems are down, we're not going home, we're fixing them. There was and I am making a concerted effort not to litter this recording with profane language, because there was a lot of profane language in those days, like, as you might be able to guess from people who worked at the NASD. Like, that's not they don't. So there was a lot of cursing. There was a lot of like, I don't know what the hell is wrong kind of thing, or but we had fun. Like, I will say we had some negative adventures too. I have told people more than once that I know what the worst sound in the world is, and they're like, what is it? And I say, it's walking into a data center that is dead silent because there's been a power failure. And everybody who's been in IT just makes the like, oh God face, because that is, in fact, the worst sound there is. Like, the fans are down, the machines aren't running, and you've got to figure out how to get everything up and running as quick as possible. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've done that, and that was a VMware adventure.
VMware was certainly going through its sort of startup phase and growing pains phase. Were some of those challenges related to that newness and growth?
No. Well, I mean, yes and no. Some of those challenges were just like, how do we make sure that the bare minimum things that this company needs are available to them? So, like, how do we make sure that Outlook is accessible over the web? How do we make sure that Outlook, is an Exchange are running effectively? And this was in the days when Outlook Web Access was really nascent, and like the ability to run Outlook and hanging it off. There weren't good docs on how to stick an Outlook web portal on the public internet, even though that was what we needed to do. So there was a lot of like, okay, well, what are we going to do? How do we figure out a proxy for this? What do we, that sort of thing. So yeah, there was some work to be done there. But in general, I think it was just, the sort of usual IT stuff of a 200-person company and so forth. Now, my job in those days was also desktop support. So like, that was 21 years ago. We didn't have LCD screens, so I did a lot of carrying around 21-inch monitors, and I had really big forearms at the time as a result of it. But that's, I don't think that our IT challenges were a result of growth speed.
Mm-hmm. In looking at your resume, you have been at VMware for more than 20 years, and you have had 10, 11 job titles.
I haven't counted, so thank you for counting for me. Yeah.
So let's walk through that journey, shall
we? Sure. So I tell the story of how I got from IT into alliances, which was my first step there. Was like, I've already teased it a little bit. When I was not always the best at being a system administrator, but I was really good at talking about computers and understanding IT systems and how they fit together. And that's a useful skill as an IT person, but it's not the most important skill as an IT person. When I moved into alliances, I moved because that was the most important skill for the Alliance SE role that I took on. So I was essentially the technical contact for all software companies that wanted to integrate with VMware. So that was, everybody from Computer Associates doing monitoring to Veritas making backup software to, pick something. And that was right in and the reason that I was the only software person was that there were 4 Alliance SEs, one for Dell, one for HP, one for IBM, and one for software vendors. And the other 3 were very focused on how do we enable those OEM vendors to go to market effectively? How do we teach their sales teams how to sell? And for me, it was much more, how do we build, how do we get them to integrate with our product? How do we get them to integrate with our product and drive things forward in such a way that we remove resistance to VMware in corporate data centers. Because at the time it was, oh, we can't use our default backup vendor, we're not bringing it into the house.
Right.
Oh, we can't use our monitoring tooling, we're not bringing it in. And so a lot of what I was doing in alliances was kind of working from a technical perspective on knocking some of those things down. And that was a really fun era. It was a lot of like figure stuff out, bob weave, keep moving. Like don't get stuck on any one thing, just keep moving forward on a lot of stuff. And my transition out of that, so that role, I started as the only technical alliance manager for software. And the organization grew, and I was definitely too junior to get any management or anything at that point. The organization grew, and eventually I was working primarily on data protection vendors, but also with very small vendors who were potential acquisition candidates, because we had one of the companies I'd been working with that was small had gotten acquired for a pittance, and we didn't know that they were getting acquired. We didn't know that there was a conversation about that, and we would have been able to make back the money that they were sold for in hours. I mean, like it would have fit very naturally into our portfolio. So the leadership was like, okay, we don't want that to happen again. Eddie, why don't you go work with all the small vendors that can't afford our fees necessarily, but who we think are technically interesting. And we ended up acquiring one of them, and that was Akimbo Systems. And James, who was the CEO of Akimbo, bless him, thought that I had done good work working with them, thought that I was reasonably smart, and said, hey, you want to come be a product manager on my team, and we'll build a new product. So I moved over to work for James on the advice of Dan Chu, who was my manager at the time.
So what was that product? Sorry, I caught
that
you.
That product was called Stage Manager. And that product taught me the product manager lesson of right product, right time. If you get either of, and I would also add right product, right time, right organization. If you get any of those things wrong, it doesn't matter that you got the others right. It was a product that in many ways, VMware and the industry are still trying to build, about managing the life cycle of software as it goes from inception through to production within a corporate organization or within an enterprise organization. The technology wasn't quite ready for it, though we probably could have made it work. But the bigger problem was that it was a complex product with a relatively long sales cycle that would have delivered a lot of value. But the length of the sales cycle meant that nobody in our field wanted to engage with it, because ESX, vSphere, or pre-vSphere, ESX at the time had essentially a 0-day return on investment. You bought it, and within a day you had saved the money that you were going to be, spending. And that led to extremely short sales cycles, and reps being able to make their quota very quickly off of that. And so they weren't interested in anything that had a longer sales cycle. I like to joke that if that product had been developed by Computer Associates or somebody like that, they would have sold the living daylights out of it. But counterfactuals.
That was going to be my question, was how well did that product fit in with what VMware was doing at the time?
It would have been, at the time, it didn't fit in well. And look, I was a 1.0 product manager on a 1.0 product. Like, that's a hard combination to begin with. So building that out, it was way ahead of its time for VMware especially. So it did not do well at all. We then folded it back into a product that had been kind of a fork off of. So there was a product called Lab Manager. Stage Manager was a branch off of it to think more holistically about full end-to-end life cycle to production. And we decided to fold it back into Lab Manager to simplify that story. And then Lab Manager we took, and this was, again, I got to lead this. We folded that back in, and Lab Manager turned into a product called vCloud Director. And vCloud Director, I got to learn the lesson of what it feels like to be part of the most important thing that the company is trying to do at the time, and be right at the nexus of trade-offs and incentives and so forth. So that was a really notable product. I got to be on stage during the keynote at VMworld that year. It was a lot of fun. And that product is still going strong, and now is kind of the centerpiece of nearly $1 billion business, the VMware Cloud Provider Program business. And it basically takes your VMware infrastructure and makes it available as if it was a cloud. Some technical decisions we made that, in hindsight, don't look perfect, but the team, bless them, has, since I'm no longer in charge of it, have evolved it and made it even better. So that was a really fun 1.0.
So I note here that you worked on vCenter Server. Tell me about that.
Yeah, that was a place where, so it became clear that vCloud Director and vCenter needed to get closer together, or one of them needed to die, or something else. As it turns out, something else is what happened. So we merged the organizations of those two things, and my boss said, we're going to try something clever. We're going to switch the heads of vCloud Director and vCenter. And so I ran vCenter for a while and helped grow that team a fair bit. I presided over one of the worst releases of vCenter that we've ever had. And I look back on that with some embarrassment. We changed the authentication subsystem for vCenter in a minor release. And so a lot of people who didn't expect major changes in a minor release were caught very much by surprise, were very angry about it. And worse of all, it just didn't work. And so, that was not a pleasant period. So that didn't work out well.
How did the team respond when it kind of blew up, for lack of a better word?
So there were a few things. One, there was a lot of firefighting, which is, I come from IT. Firefighting is fun for me. Two, there was certainly denial, where we said, nah, it's going to be fine. It's going to be fine. It's going to be fine. And, Raghu, bless him, this is one of Raghu's superpowers, is he looked at it and was like, it's not going to be fine. And so he grabbed a project that was going on elsewhere, kind of buried in the organization, and said, you guys need to be ready to replace this terrible identity subsystem with yours in the next release. You have 18 months, go. So we worked, that team worked really hard and managed to do that. And that was very successful. That came out. So that was vCenter 5.1 and 5.5.
Sorry, I'm just writing down stuff, scribbling all over my page. Software-defined data center. This is
so what happened?
Huge.
Yeah,
this is a huge right.
Yeah.
The company's
we're
going to do this whole big thing now.
Yeah. So there were a couple of things that happened there. So the first, from my career perspective, and I'm just talking about me, not about VMware. So if you ever want me to flip over and start talking about products and what it felt like and so forth, I can. The vCenter team grew to a big enough point where it needed to be split. And I said, I want to work on common services. And my peer decided he wanted to own the vCenter server. And so the idea was we were going to build a set of common core services that would be cross-cutting, that everybody would be able to integrate with and use, and that would help us standardize the experience across VMware. That really didn't work. And I still haven't quite decided why it didn't work. It's a hard question to answer. One is, incentives for people to adopt common services when the business is growing fast. We're not really there. So that was, it was an interesting year and a half, year or so. And I decided, at the end of that, I kind of looked around and said, I've just spent the last year and a half where my customers were other VMware products inside the company as opposed to, end customers. Maybe I want to change that. And so I went and did product marketing for a year and started kind of developing messaging and managed a team there and so forth. And I learned that while I can do it if I have to, I don't enjoy it as much as I enjoy product management. And so when I got the opportunity about a year after that to kind of come back into product management, it was very clear, like all of a sudden, like it was like a duck to back in the water. Like I understood where the different things were, where the levers were. And that move back into product management was when we were booting up the VMware Validated Design program. And that I'm really, really quite proud of. That was us essentially taking what was all of VMware's disparate set of products and treating the architecture to deploy them all together, treating a reference architecture for them as if it were a product. And so we stepped back and said, okay, what are the kinds of things that you have if you're a product? Well, you have a version and you have an upgrade path and you have a QA and so on and so forth. And so all of those things fit together. And we thought about all of those things together and how do we stitch those products together and how do we build the systems that reinforce compatibility as opposed to catch compatibility at the last minute. So things like interop as release criteria program that we started, which forced all the different component teams in the entire SDDC to test against this reference architecture before they released. We got our professional services team to start using this reference architecture as the core to everything that they were deploying. And the way we did that is we'd go through and we'd basically say, you can deploy any way you want to. You have, you'll be supported, etc. But this is how we do our interop testing. And even JP Morgan was like, we're tired of you trying to adapt to our infrastructure. We're going to adapt to yours and see if that works better. And it turned out that was incredibly successful. And that design and that approach to things is now how all of VMware is essentially sold through Cloud Foundation. So the VMware Cloud Foundation was a parallel project with the same kind of spirit, built with the same built with automation instead of the architecture design as the first point. So we converged those two, but that was as I was leaving the organization that convergence happened.
So where did the directive or the genesis of this sort of standardization idea come from?
Yeah, so this is where I give a lot of credit to John Gilmartin, who saw that this was going to be a problem way earlier than many of the rest of us did. And he basically said, look, this is what I want to build. So he built the integrated systems business unit, and he really worked on that interoperability. One of the core symptoms that caused us to invest in it was we had sold a product offering called vCloud Suite that was a very convenient way to purchase the products, but did not get very much deployment. And in particular, of the hundreds of customers that had purchased the entire vCloud Suite, only 9 had ever deployed all of it. Yeah, it was bad. And the shortest deployment time for that was 11 months. And that was also catastrophically bad. And we were looking and seeing, hey, those 3-year ELAs are going to start expiring real soon. And that's going to be financially problematic for us, let alone the customer satisfaction problems that we're facing here as well. So there was some real concerted effort to be like, okay, what are we going to do to fix that? Like, how do we get deployments of the software-defined data center? So there was a program that was run in parallel to validated designs called the 400 program. Was like, how are we going to get 400 deployments for the SDDC? And we were successful in that. Now, some of that was dumb luck that we were successful, but we managed to drive it a little bit with validated designs and so forth. And so that was a really fun project to work on. I got to collaborate with some really smart people. We got to solve some really good problems and everybody pulling together in the same direction. And it was also a lot of like running around internally and selling different business units on, this is why you have to do this. It's better for the customers, but it's also going to help you get deployments. And ultimately deployments are going to result in expansion as opposed to just land and die. And we got buy-in from that from leadership, and that was good.
To look a little bit bigger about VMware's trajectory, like what are the big high marking points maybe that you would point to when the company I don't want to say change direction.
What are the inflection points?
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So there's a couple of really, really obvious ones. The first one predates me, and that is when IBM decided that they couldn't own ESX and sell it because of open source concerns, that they would need it to be an independent company. So like VMware didn't get bought by IBM, even though that was a possibility. And that enabled the OEM business model entirely. And that was just the lion's share of revenue for VMware for a number of years. We were selling, but it was fulfilled through the OEMs. There was good alignment there. There wasn't resistance there. And that was really critical. So that was one, and that predated me by a little bit. The second major one that I would call out is when Microsoft bought Connectix, which was we're the makers of Virtual PC, which was the only real competitor at the time to VMware. At first, we were terrified. We were like, "Oh God, it's going to be awful." And transparently, I think that part of the reason, I don't know this. This is what the scuttlebutt was at the time. That part of the reason that VMware sold to EMC was because we were worried about getting into a knockdown dragout with Microsoft as an independent company, but with the weight of EMC behind us, wouldn't have been a problem. Like we'd be fine. I have funny stories about the EMC acquisition, if you want to hear those at some point. And then, so Microsoft buying Connectix was a big one. And then after the EMC acquisition, Microsoft announced that they were going to be rewriting Virtual PC into Hyper-V. And as Carl Eschenbach, our sales leader at the time, said, look, they've literally just told the world we have the right architecture and they need to adapt to our architecture. What more validation could we possibly want? And that further accelerated things. The next kind of inflection point that I would probably call out from a VMware growth perspective, like, I don't know, the mid 2010s when vSphere, well, okay, no, let me step back further a little bit. VI3, I joke, was when we introduced the distributed resource scheduler. We introduced what became called VMware HA. At the time, it was called DAS, the Distributed Availability Subsystem, and VMware Consolidated Backup. Those three capabilities, DRS at least, we were still selling as the flagship feature 10 years, 15 years later. And it was the transformative thing. And, that also kind of highlighted that sometimes it doesn't make sense to stick to a schedule. VI3 was a year and change late from what we had planned, but the feature set and the capabilities were so big and so transformative that it didn't matter that it was late. It kind of established us as the absolute lead of the market. It also stepped us from virtualization of one server to virtualization of clusters. So that instead of thinking of one host, you started to think of groups of hosts as a unit of management. That was a really big shift. And then I think that the next substantial shift was when Paul Moritz came in. I don't know about timing wise, but Paul came in and just said cloud over and over and over again. And VMware internally had been kind of ignoring cloud. And Paul just said the word cloud and people were like, yeah. But after, 18 months of him saying it, the organization really did start to turn and move in that direction. And while Paul definitely had the vision, he didn't necessarily have and had very interesting vision, didn't necessarily have the execution chops. And some of the lieutenants that he brought in to drive execution had impedance mismatches with VMware. And so that was like, it was challenging. It was a very interesting lesson from the outside of the executive suite anyway, in what different CEOs and different lieutenants of CEOs can do for the growth of the company. Like the company was still growing, we were still doing great, but it was like you could see the tensions start to emerge and so forth. I suppose the next big inflection was, Pat coming in and basically saying, okay, we're going to get much crisper about the stuff that we're doing and the stuff that we're not doing. And so he sold a bunch of stuff that Paul had acquired, and got us out of the general IT business and much more into the server focused business. And then stuck around on our cloud service for much longer than was appropriate. We just didn't have the right technology stack at the time to be able to operate as a cloud, and we didn't have the right people working on it. And so that was the vCloud Air business, and it was not successful. And he, I believe he said that was, he thinks his biggest mistake was sticking on that for too long. But Pat brought in kind of like, okay, we're going to cut some of the stuff that Paul was doing, but then we're going to execute much more effectively on the other stuff that Paul wanted us to be doing. And so the thing that I think was very impressive about Pat was he both drove execution and evolved that strategy over time, like executed on the strategy that was there and knew how much he could turn the wheel on a year by year basis to change that strategy. So for example, when is it appropriate for us to go from selling individual products to the suite of products as the primary go-to-market? Well, like that didn't happen until about, I don't know, a year and a half ago, 2 years. So like right around, just before he was leaving. But he knew that we could get more revenue out by selling these things independently, and that the shift was not quite ready to happen yet.
Can you say something about how the corporate culture at VMware has changed or maintained?
Yeah, I figured that was going to be a question, and I thought about whether that was something I could answer or if I knew how to. It's hard to, it's very much the like you're the frog in the boiling water kind of thing. Like I don't know how it's changed. It's just like, like I've been here the whole time. It's I will say that it has always been very relationship focused or relationship driven. I don't know if that's something other people have said, but like I have been successful by knowing who to talk to or knowing who to talk to find out who to talk to about problem X. I will also say that maybe the funniest thing I have ever said about VMware was Cindy Braun and I were talking once, and she said, well, VMware, we hate process. And I said, Cindy, we don't hate process. She said, what do you mean? I said, we love process. We hate repeating a process, but you give us a chance to invent a new process, and we are happier than pigs in slop. And she did allow as though I might have a point about that. That was an accurate characterization, that we do like to invent a new process, but we hate repeating them. I think that, maybe one of the things that's changed over the last probably 10 years is that we've gotten better as a company at repeating processes, at, actually building systems that are durable. Some of that started when I was in the vCenter and vCloud Director and even Common Services days, where one of the things that we did was we had an engineering manager who had a small subset of the product sit in the release meetings for the major releases, for multiple releases in a row as a way of carrying over institutional knowledge. So this was Avishai. And so he owned a small chunk of the product. He wouldn't necessarily have been in the release meetings, but he came, like, intentionally they had him attend the vSphere 4.5 meetings and the vSphere 5 meetings and the 5.1 meetings as a way of carrying some of that information over. Like that was how knowledge got passed across in those days. And over time, what's happened is that those things, instead of having somebody sit in the room to carry that along, have been systematized, have been built into durable checklists and processes and so forth that can then be disseminated across wider business units and so forth. So like that's one evolution that certainly has happened, is that we've gotten better at writing things down. Obviously at some point there was a shift where most of our innovation happened through acquisition. I couldn't tell you when that was because I don't know, but like it happened at some point, probably around the, I can't remember whether NSX or vSAN was first, but vSAN was very much internal organic growth, and NSX was, we had the same kinds of ideas growing internally, but NSX was so far ahead. Nicira was far enough ahead that it was like, okay, we should go buy them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was also very much a Joe Tucci was like, they're so far ahead, go buy them. Kind of it's just a coaster.
It's fine. Um, tell us your stories of the EMC acquisition.
Oh man, there's two or three that are really funny. The first one is I was the IT person on call the night before it was going to be announced. And so, or no, I was like in the office doing backups, like switching tapes at, Sunday night at 6 p.m. I didn't live very far from the office at that time, which was stupid as an IT person. Like you always want to live a long way so that somebody else gets the call. So I was like in the office doing something, and Betsy walks in, and I'm like, is Betsy here? And Diane's walking through, and two or three other Mendel's going by, and I'm like, what the hell is going on? And then a cadre of people show up in suits, and I was like, and so like Betsy and I still laugh about this. I said to Betsy, should I ask what's going on? And she said, no. And I said, okay, I won't. And then they came to me later and said, hey, can you get us a network connection that's outside the firewall in the boardroom upstairs? And I was like, yeah, I can do that. That's not a problem. So like I knew how to wire that up. I needed to get a little help from somebody, but so that was thing one. And then after the acquisition was announced, when we were in the process of closing, it was just a really interesting lesson in small company, like scrappy IT versus big company IT. We met people from their IT teams, and they were like, okay, so who does your we'd be like, who's your firewall guy? And he's like, yeah, that's me. And I'm like, well, what else do you do? He's like, I'm the firewall guy.
Right.
And we're like, we have a firewall guy. He also runs our Exchange server and our Windows file services. Like what? Okay, I guess that's cool that you're just the firewall guy. That's an interesting job, but seems kind of boring. And then the last thing that happened was, so EMC, obviously their big competitor at the time was NetApp. And our internal file servers were all NetApp file servers. So they toured, all of our mini data centers and so forth. And they were like, why do you have a NetApp back there? And my boss was like, because it's the best NFS server on the planet. And they kind of looked at him and went, yeah, you're right. We wish we could run those, but we can't. That was great. I wish that the NetApp file server was also the example that I wish I had taken a picture of the craziest thing I've ever seen in a data center. Was we had a bundle of power cables like this that were held together by a cable wrapped around them and tied in a knot. That was a fiber channel cable that was carrying data from a shelf of disks to the head. And so you look at this, you're like, why is that still working? And it was like, well, it's fiber. So it's light. There's no RF interference from the power cables. It should be fine. It's like somehow someone had managed to tie it into a knot without violating the bend radius. And like, I'm not going to untie that thing. You going to untie that thing? I'm not untying that thing. Like, so yeah, that was also the era where I had maybe the funniest call I've ever had with tech support, where we called, we had a power supply in one of our 1U boxes catch fire. And when that happens, because there's, powerful fans in there, you get a 3-foot jet of smoke out the back, just blown, very, very quickly. And so we called Dell and said, this happened. And they say, please unplug the machine. Really? Like, you needed to tell me that one? That was like, that's on your checklist? Yeah, I know.
Unplug it.
Yeah. I'll give you one more really fun story from back in those days. We were cheap as a company. Cheap. Anything over $1,000 had to be approved by Diane, and she wouldn't approve things. Like, she would just be like, spin up a VM for this. And so one of the things that, like, I want to be really clear. That is to her credit. Like, we survived a lot of stuff because she wouldn't spend money. Like, it's better to have cash on hand. It did lead to once when we needed to buy 3 servers to run backups. It was not a thing that you could virtualize at the time. Like, they needed to actually be physical machines. That I actually bought from Dell on 3 successive days, 3 successive 1U servers for $998.75 because that kept it under the $1,000 limit where Diane had to sign off on it. So I bought 3 of them on 3 days, and then I called back on the 4th day and bought a support contract on all 3. as a way of getting under the cap on that. And it worked out.
It
Okay.
worked. Yeah,
It worked. Like,
absolutely.
this is what you did when you're a 300 person company trying to be scrappy. So.
Yeah. How much of VMware's product were you utilizing,
Oh, in the early
internally?
days,
Yeah, in the early
all of it.
days. All of it.
Like that was sort of the transformative thing for me. Was it took about I used to say 6 weeks, but it probably was like 6 days before I was like, I will never run a data center without this. This is amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, we need to stand up a new server instead of going out and buying hardware and waiting for delivery and so forth, and dorking around while that happens, or finding something spare and maybe not working very well someplace. Just create a new virtual machine. It was awesome. Like just instantly transformative. We were using both ESX and GSX at the time internally, and it was really clear ESX worked better. But the GSX team was insistent that we needed to use it internally, because otherwise, like, how is the team gonna have the incentive to fix bugs and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And so we ran GSX internally as well. One of the things that I always say is interesting from that era was one of the problems that you have when you have about 5 ESX servers and nothing else is you create a virtual machine and you forget where you put it.
Uh-huh.
Like, okay, which one of those 5 servers did I put it on? And so one of the 3 of us in IT, not me, somebody who was a much better programmer, actually wrote a small piece of software called Blink that would just go talk to all of the ESX servers, query the status of all of those VMs. And that was kind of what we used before vCenter, before Virtual Center was created, to monitor the health of all of those VMs and to remember where they were. Like that was literally the problem space. So I used to joke that like part of the reason we sold so much vCenter and had such high attach was it solved a problem that we created. Where did you put that last VM? Like, well, okay, you created the problem. You're clearly going to know how to solve it for me, is what customers would think, we would think.
Well, and certainly if you had that problem, then
every
IT department is going to have the same problem.
It's exactly right.
Yeah.
It was an absolute no-brainer of a product decision of like, okay, that's
there wasn't a notepad next to the server rack that was like, this is where this one is.
Of Notepad, all of our firewall rules were stored in Notepad files on Rick's Windows machine, and like the way we configured Cisco was we literally just pasted a Notepad file in, because that was the best way to do it in those days.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little hard to remember the insanity from that era, the sort of cowboy. That maybe 3 weeks after I started, we had a full system downtime, intentional. Like we were small enough at that point that we could say everything's going to be down for the weekend. And the amount of stuff we got done over that weekend was unbelievable. Like we upgraded Exchange from 5.1 to 5.5. We built out multiple new file servers. We built out multiple new gateway systems. Like it was just unbelievable. We didn't sleep for 3 days, but it was unbelievably effective to be able to do that.
So tell me about what you're currently working on.
So about 4 years ago, October 1st, before the pandemic. So that's 4 years ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Mm-hmm.
I moved out of our core products. So working on SDDC, working on validated designs, working on enterprise readiness initiative, cross-cutting. And I decided I wanted to work more in the developer space, that either I was going to need to get much, much deeper and more specific in the in infrastructure space, or I was going to need to move up into the developer kind of cloud native space. So I moved over onto our Kubernetes team. And Craig McLucky, who was the Heptio CEO, who we was one of the founders of Kubernetes, we acquired their company. What he said was, I don't like to do opportunistic hires. I was looking and it's like, hey, do you have a role for me? But we really need somebody who understands how VMware works, because nobody over here understands how VMware works. And you seem to understand how VMware works. And we're about to acquire Pivotal, which is going to be an influx of hundreds of people who don't understand how VMware works. And so like, we definitely need someone with your skill set. And so it was a really good fit for me because I could bring a bunch of stuff to the table knowing about how VMware works, but I also got to spend a lot of time learning about the developer space, about modern applications, about all of those sorts of things, which was really interesting because it was not something that I got exposed to when I was deep in the IT space. And so now I talk much more about like making developers happy than I ever did before. I have a lot of anti-developer jokes from my days in IT, but now like, how do we make them happy? How do we make them productive? That's one of the core goals.
And how do you think this fits in with VMware's big picture, moving into the developer space?
I think that the answer to that question is still being written, and that the acquisition of VMware by Broadcom will likely change how it is written. I think that it has not gone as well as it could have, but it has not been as bad as it could have been either. Like anything else from VMware's history, like it depends is the standard VMware answer for everything. So I think it's gone reasonably well, but it could have gone better. I think that we missed an opportunity to try and drive Kubernetes as a cross-cutting layer more effectively across clouds. And instead, it seems to have been, the decision seems to have been kind of calcified that Kubernetes you get from your cloud vendor. And so like vSphere is going to have a Kubernetes,
Right.
Amazon's going to have a Kubernetes, and so forth. And I think that there was an opportunity for us to really establish an independent Kubernetes set of offerings that were cross-cloud, but that window is mostly closed now. And that's that's my opinion. Like at this point,
Yep.
We've moved out of the realm of history and into
Yes.
Future speculation.
Futures.
So it's
Yes.
a little bit harder to be sure.
Just checking our time. It's 1 minute to 3.
I can run long.
You can run a little long. Dan, are you flexible to do 10 more minutes or so? Okay, super. And at some point, my kids will barge into the house, and then we'll know it's time to stop.
I'm familiar with that phenomenon too.
You can see how tall they are. Okay. Just really quick. So I want to be sure to ask you about some of the people. You mentioned the importance of relationships at VMware. Who are some of the people that you point to as really having a strong impact on your career?
Oh gosh. So I think probably the first person that's worth mentioning is Dino Ciccarelli. Michael Ciccarelli is his actual name, but everybody calls him Dino because there was a hockey player in Detroit named Dino Ciccarelli, and so that became his nickname when he was young. So Dino was my first boss outside of IT. So he hired me into the Alliances team. He actually went to Pivotal when Pivotal spun out of VMware and ran professional services and such over there for them. So he's actually back at VMware still now, and I get to work with him occasionally. But like, he was an absolutely critical figure, both in terms of calling bullshit on product, like being able to say like, no, this thing that you're building is terrible, but also just for me to be able to say, we got to get you out of IT. You can do more than that. Come on, let's go. So that was really, really important for me. James Phillips, for similar reasons, saying, hey, you can come be a product manager. You can do a good job of this. And then I would probably call out the developers that I worked with on those first couple of products, not just James, but like Wilson Huang, who went over to Facebook, or Gaurav Lochan, or Shane Lowry. Those three really kind of taught me how to be a product manager by telling me that what I was doing was, no, that's wrong. No, don't worry about that thing. Even though I would have, day-long fights with them about the thing that I wanted to worry about. They were right that I shouldn't have worried about it. That was really, they were really important folks for me. I would say Henry Robinson, who I miss, who retired about a year and a half ago, he was just a great manager. He's a kind of a legendary curmudgeon, and I learned how to use him as my manager by saying, you can talk to me about this, or I can escalate and we can bring Henry in. And people be like, fine, I'll talk with you about this. Okay. And Henry was rough to work with sometimes, but he also was, he understood how to manage the organization both up and down really effectively, and showed me a lot of stuff with that. And I also really I liked working with Henry. Tracy Boyle, who is the best release manager I ever worked with, she was amazing. She was another one of those people who really taught me how to be a product manager more effectively, and call me out when I wasn't doing my job effectively, and saying, this is what it looks like when you're doing well. You're not doing that now. So she was great. From kind of a leadership perspective, I would say John Gilmartin is just fantastic. He's a good human. He is, as even keel, deadpan, just chill as you can be. Nothing ever seems to faze him. We did a massive rename of multiple products that he and I were working on 2 weeks before VMworld one year. And I said, John, someday we're going to have a VMworld that isn't a complete shit show like this. And he said, no, we're not. And I was like, what? He was like, if it was easy, they wouldn't pay us for it. And I went, okay, fair. And the number of times I've repeated that to myself of if it was easy, they wouldn't pay us for it. Is not small. So now he's running product management for our cloud business group, and he's great. He's just a good dude. Understands how to navigate organizations, understands how to work politically, but isn't political. He's really fun to work with. Bill Shelton, who was really interesting. So Bill hired me to help run vCloud Director, and really kind of, it was under Bill that I essentially went from senior product manager through to group product manager on the track to get to director, where he basically said, I need you to run vCloud Director. And I did. And he was like, this is great. And I was like, I don't think it's senior product manager. He's like, no, it is much better. So we need to get you promoted. It's like, okay. Who else? Dale Ferrario, who was the engineering VP who I worked with on vCloud, not vCloud, on common services, and more explicitly on VMware validated designs. He was a really good, he understood how to bounce ideas back and forth and how to get definitions hammered out. And he's just great.
Great.
And how to navigate the organization as well, which is, a skill that I don't.
Yeah.
I don't have enough of, I would say.
Last question, which we ask everybody. What do you think is the lasting impact of VMware's technology?
I think that, okay, so sort of two answers. The first is, I think it was absolutely impossible to do, was literally believed to be impossible to do. I was at an Intel developer forum right when they were introducing their Vanderpool technology VT at the time, and I explained what VMware did, and one of their engineers was like, oh, so you'll be able to do that now. And I was like, no, we've been doing this for 7 years. And he said, no, that's impossible. And I was like, well, I assure you, it's not. We've been doing it for several years. So that was transformative. Once that became possible, and once it became clear that that was valuable, it caused Intel to do what they did with the chips. It caused multiple hypervisors to spin up. That allowed cloud computing, which is how everything works today, essentially, where infrastructure is programmable. That whole thing would not have happened. Well, the technology that is VMware was a necessary first step for that to happen. In the sort of history philosophy thing, it is likely that somebody would have invented it, if not VMware, just because it needed to happen. But it probably wouldn't have happened as early, and it wouldn't have happened as quickly. And I think that VMware was an independent company, an independent software company during all of that was also really transformative, because it's the technology would have done very different things if it had been captive of a major
Yeah,
hardware vendor.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's all I have for you.
Okay.
Anything else you want to share before we sign off?
No, I don't think so. I should probably thank Raghu as well, who's also been, a buddy, and an incredible inspiration through all of this. I like to tease him that I gave him his first laptop at VMware because I was in IT when he started. I created his account and gave him his first computer. It's been all downhill since then. Yeah,
All right. Thank you so much.
absolutely.
It's
Thank
been a
you.
real
This is fun.
pleasure.